I was there when Tallarn died for the second time. The first death, during the heresy, had been fire and poison, a world scoured by virus bombs and left a lifeless desert where once oceans had gleamed. That death had been quick, a single day of screaming silence as billions choked on their own dissolving lungs. But the second death, 10,000 years later, was something altogether different. It was a death that refused to end, a dying that sustained itself, that celebrated itself with every labored breath and every putrefying cell. I am Castor Vendamius, captain of the Brazen Minotaur's 4th Company, and I wish to the throne that I could forget what I witnessed in those plague-choked months. We had arrived on Tallarn in response to distress calls that made no sense. The desert world, famous for its armored regiments and the scars of ancient betrayal, had gone silent 3 weeks prior. Then the transmissions began. Not the crisp military communications you'd expect from one of the Imperium's most disciplined guard regiments, but broken vox chatter that came in waves of static and wet, bubbling laughter. The messages spoke of gifts and blessings, of a grandfather's love that transformed suffering into acceptance, of a garden that grew in the hearts of the faithful. The Departamento Munitorum classified it as a standard chaos incursion, perhaps a warband of the Death Guard making a symbolic strike at a world they'd once tried to claim. They were catastrophically wrong. As our strike cruiser Adamantine Will translated into real space at the edge of the Tallarn system, our augurs immediately registered impossible readings. The planet's atmosphere, which should have been thin and dusty, had somehow doubled in density. More troubling still, it was moving, great convective currents spiraling across the surface in patterns that my ship's cogitator insisted were mathematically alive. Brother Librarian Theron stood beside me on the command deck, his psychic hood humming with active suppression fields, and I watched his enhanced physiology betray him with a visible shudder. "Captain," he said, his voice tight with controlled horror. "The warp is open here, not breached, not torn, open, as though reality itself has simply relaxed its vigilance. I had served the Emperor for 3 centuries. I had fought Xenos horrors and turned back chaos incursions on a dozen worlds. I thought I understood the enemy we faced. Standing there, watching Tallarn rotate beneath us like a swollen greenish-brown tumor suspended in the void, I realized how little any of us truly comprehended about the arch-enemies of mankind. The world below wasn't just infected or corrupted. It was being digested, processed through some cosmic metabolism that transformed adamantine faith and desert endurance into something that laughed at pain and called decay a sacrament. We made planetfall at what had been Firebase Secundus, one of the hardened military installations that dotted Tallarn's surface. The firebase was still there, technically. Its walls stood, its towers rose against the sickly green sky, its blast doors remained sealed. But as our Thunderhawks descended through atmospheric layers that felt like pushing through layers of diseased tissue, I saw that every surface was coated in a film of organic matter, not rust or corrosion, but actual living tissue, pulsing faintly with bioluminescent patterns that spelled out words in languages I didn't recognize and somehow understood anyway. Welcome, rest, accept, grow. The moment my boots touched Tallarn's surface, I knew we had made a mistake. The air tasted wrong. That was my first coherent thought after clearing the Thunderhawk's assault ramp, bolter at ready, scanning for hostile contacts through the faceplate of my Mark 7 Maximus pattern armor. It wasn't the expected desert air, thin, dry, gritty with blown sand. This air was thick, humid, carrying scents that my enhanced olfactory receptors identified as human sweat, rotting vegetation, and something underneath it all that registered as simultaneously putrid and oddly sweet, like overripe fruit left to ferment in summer heat. Atmospheric composition shows 0.73 standard oxygen, elevated nitrogen, and... Brother Sergeant Kalen's voice came through the vox, then stopped. Captain, my armor's sensors are registering organic compounds that aren't in any Imperial database. Some of them are... They're proteins that couldn't naturally exist. The amino acid chains are too complex, too perfectly structured. Biomancy, Tallarn said quietly, stepping down beside me. The librarian's force staff crackled with barely contained psychic energy, and I noticed his free hand was clenched in a warding gesture I'd seen him use only once before, during the Bleeding Moon incident on Vortigern Prime. The plague, God's gifts, don't simply corrupt. They create. Every virus, every bacterium, every parasitic worm is individually designed, lovingly crafted. This entire world has become a laboratory of suffering. The firebase's main gate stood open. Not breached, not blasted apart. Simply open, as though the garrison had unlocked it and walked away. My tactical squad moved forward in practiced formation, bolters tracking arcs of fire, each brother covering his fellow's advance. The inner courtyard should have held vehicle parks, ammunition bunkers, training grounds worn by 10,000 years of regimental boots. Instead, we found a garden. That word doesn't capture what grew there, but human language fails when confronted with Nurgle's works. Imagine plants, if you can call them that, with translucent stems showing circulatory systems pumping fluids that shifted between blood red and bilious green. Flowers bloomed with petals of diseased flesh, their centers weeping pus that pooled in stigmata bearing clear resemblance to human eyes. Trees rose 30 meters high, their bark textured like cracked scabrous skin, their branches ending not in leaves but in hands, actual human hands, still moving, still reaching, fingers twitching in apparent ecstasy or agony. I couldn't tell which. And the smell. Emperor, forgive me, but the smell was almost pleasant if you breathed it in deeply enough. The initial revulsion gave way to a creeping warmth, a sense of being welcomed home after a long and painful journey. I caught myself taking a second breath before discipline reasserted itself, and I switched my armor to internal air supply. "Where are the defenders?" Brother Kalen asked, his voice carrying the confusion we all felt. 3 full regiments garrisoned here. 30,000 Imperial Guard, their tanks, their munitions. Where did they go? Brother Tallarn raised his force staff, and psychic light spilled across the garden in waves of cerulean illumination. Wherever that light touched, the pleasant warmth fled, replaced by a bone-deep chill that felt cleaner than the alternative. In that psychic radiance, I saw what the garden truly was, and my transhuman physiology barely contained the gorge rising in my throat. The plants weren't growing from the soil, they were growing from the soldiers. Every flower, every tree, every vine and creeping tendril emerged from human bodies that weren't quite dead, weren't quite alive, but existed in some state between where the boundaries had become meaningless. I could see faces in the bark of the trees, stretched and blurred but still recognizable as human. The hands reaching from the branches were attached to arms that disappeared into the trunks. And if you looked closely, Emperor help me, I looked closely, you could see the muscles in those arms still working, still functioning, pumping nutrients up through bodies that had become the garden's infrastructure. "They're still alive," I whispered, the words barely audible even through the vox. "After 3 weeks, they're still alive." "Alive is perhaps not the right word," Tallarn said, and I heard exhaustion in his voice, the particular weariness that comes from understanding too much. "They're sustained, transformed. The blessing of the plague god is that nothing truly dies in his garden. It simply changes form, becomes part of the eternal cycle. Their bodies produce the nutrients that feed new growths. Their minds..." He paused, then continued more quietly. "Their minds have been opened to understand the beauty of it all. They feel no pain, Captain. They feel joy." A wet, rattling laugh echoed across the courtyard, and we whirled to face its source. He had been a colonel once. I could tell from the tattered remnants of his uniform, still clinging to a body that had been so thoroughly transformed that calling it human required generous interpretation. His flesh had swollen to perhaps 3 times normal mass, skin stretched taut over tumorous growths that pulsed with their own heartbeats. His face, if the arrangement of features still qualified as a face, split into a smile that revealed teeth like tombstones, each one carved with microscopic scripture I couldn't read, but somehow understood promised peace through surrender. "Brothers," he said, and his voice was beautiful. That's what I remember most clearly. Not the horror of his appearance or the corruption radiating from him like heat from a forge, but the sheer melodic quality of his voice, rich and warm and genuinely pleased to see us. "Brothers of the false emperor, welcome to paradise. Grandfather has been expecting you." My bolt pistol was in my hand without conscious thought, the barrel aimed at his center mass. "In the Emperor's name, identify yourself. I am Colonel Vastian, 5th Tallarn Desert Raiders, though such designations seem quaint now." He gestured around the courtyard with hands whose fingers had fused into spade-like appendages. "I commanded this firebase for 14 years. I sent men to die for a corpse god who never answered their prayers, who let them suffer and bleed and scream in the darkness. Then Grandfather answered instead. Would you like to know what he said?" "No," I said and fired. The mass-reactive bolt punched through Vastian's sternum and detonated inside his chest cavity. At this range, the explosion should have torn him apart, reduced him to a spray of gore and bone fragments. Instead, he staggered back a single step, looked down at the fist-sized hole in his torso with mild curiosity and laughed. The wound didn't bleed so much as weep, and already I could see things growing in the crater. Tiny polyps and cysts that began knitting the damage back together even as I watched. "Do you see?" Vastian spread his arms wide. "This is the gift. No more death, no more fear. Only the endless cycle of growth and decay and rebirth. Your Emperor promises salvation after death, demands you suffer nobly until that cold release. Grandfather Nurgle offers salvation now, in the acceptance of your nature as rotting meat animated by electric impulse. He doesn't demand you transcend your flesh. He celebrates it, exalts it, transforms it into something that endures." "Squad," I said calmly, "purge this heresy." 20 bolters spoke as one. The barrage would have obliterated a main battle tank. Vastian came apart under the withering fire, chunks of his transformed flesh blasting across the courtyard to splatter against the garden's unnatural plants. For 3 seconds we poured death into him, and when we stopped, there was nothing left that resembled a human being, just scattered meat and bone and organs that shouldn't exist. The pieces twitched, they moved, they laughed with Vastian's voice, each fragment continuing his interrupted sentence. "Something that endures beyond your Imperium's capacity to destroy." The chunks of flesh began flowing toward each other, drawn by some force that violated every law of thermodynamics I'd learned in the chapter's Scholarium. They merged, fused, grew. Within 30 heartbeats, Colonel Vastian stood before us again, completely restored, his form perhaps even more robust than before. The only difference was his smile had grown wider. "This is Nurgle's true brutality," Theron said softly beside me. "Not the killing, but the prevention of killing. He doesn't grant his followers immortality in the sense of invulnerability. He makes them indestructible through transformation. How do you fight an enemy who grows stronger from their wounds, who views destruction as merely another phase of existence?" I had no answer. My transhuman mind, trained and augmented to process tactical situations with superhuman speed, found no protocol for this. Every option I considered, orbital bombardment, promethium immolation, cyclonic torpedoes, felt inadequate. We could destroy this firebase, could burn it to the bedrock and atomize every molecule of corrupted flesh. But Vastian would endure somehow, or the knowledge he represented would spread. or the garden's spores would drift on solar winds to other worlds. The colonel's smile softened to something almost pitying. You begin to understand, I think. Let me show you what your rejection of grandfather's gifts has cost. He gestured, and the garden responded. The flesh trees parted like curtains, their reaching hands pulling aside to reveal a passage deeper into the firebase. Vastian walked that path without concern, his transformed body exuding a miasma of corruption that withered even the already diseased plants where it drifted. Against every tactical instinct I possessed, I followed. My brothers came with me, weapons ready, but some part of me already knew those weapons would prove irrelevant. The passage led underground, into bunkers that should have housed command centers and armories. Instead, we found a cathedral. I use that word deliberately, because what else do you call a space that's been transformed into a monument to worship? The walls of reinforced ferrocrete had been replaced, consumed, transmuted, into ribbed columns of bone and sinew that supported a vaulted ceiling, dripping with bioluminescent mucus. The light it produced was dim and greenish, casting everything in the palette of old bruises and gangrene. At the center of the cathedral stood something that had been an Imperial altar. I knew this because I could still see fragments of the original structure, golden aquila twisted and melted, purity seals hanging like rotted flesh from hooks that had once held sacred banners. But now the altar supported something else, a tree unlike any we'd seen above. This one was massive, its trunk easily 5 meters in diameter, its branches spreading to embrace the entire chamber. And in its bark, preserved like insects in amber, were faces, thousands of them, tens of thousands. The entire garrison, Vastian said reverently, every man, woman, and servitor who stood duty here. Grandfather preserved them all, integrated them into his design. They are the foundation of paradise, Captain. Their suffering, decades of service to an ungrateful Imperium, centuries of accumulated pain passed down through regimental traditions, has been transmuted into pure joy. They understand now what you refuse to see. I approached the tree, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. My armor's sensors screamed warnings about toxic spore concentrations and mutagenic radiation, but I had to see. Had to know if Vastian spoke truth or merely sophisticated lies wrapped in demonic manipulation. A face stared back at me from the bark. A young man, barely 20 standard years, with corporal's stripes still visible on the uniform fragment that had become one with his transformed flesh. His eyes were open. They tracked my movement. And when I leaned closer, I heard him whisper through lips that had become part of the tree's texture. "It doesn't hurt anymore," he said, and his voice held wonder. "It doesn't hurt." I recoiled as if burned. Theron caught my arm, steadied me with strength that had nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with the psychic fortitude that made him worthy of his rank. "It's a lie," the librarian said firmly. "Don't let the demon's manipulation—" "It's not a lie," Vastian interrupted, and for the first time his voice held something other than beatific certainty. It held sadness, genuine sorrow for our inability to comprehend. "That's what makes it so terrible, brother librarian. It's not a lie. They truly feel no pain. They've been transformed beyond suffering, given a form of existence where entropy becomes ecstasy, where decay is just another phase of a cycle they're privileged to observe from within. The plague god doesn't torture his followers. He liberates them from the tyranny of the flesh's limitations, by making them not human," I said, and my voice came out as a growl that would have done my chapter's totemic beast proud. "By stripping away everything that makes them people and reducing them to this, to decorations in a garden of madness." "Is it madness?" Vastian stepped closer, and I noticed with clinical detachment that his bare feet left prints of putrescent slime on the cathedral floor, each one sprouting tiny mushrooms before dissolving back into the substrate. "Or is it evolution? Consider, Captain, every human suffers. Your Imperium is built on suffering, the suffering of untold trillions who toil in darkness, who die in wars they don't understand for an emperor they've never seen, who pray to a god corpse bound to a failing throne. That's your truth. Grandfather Nurgle offers an alternative. Accept the suffering, embrace it, and transcend it by becoming one with the universal processes of growth and decay. No more fear, no more despair. Only acceptance and the eternal joy of transformation. I wanted to argue. Emperor knows I wanted to refute every word with righteous fury and bolter fire. But standing in that charnel cathedral, surrounded by the transformed remnants of 30,000 Imperial Guard, I couldn't deny the horrifying logic of it. This was Nurgle's true brutality. Not the physical corruption, not the diseases and plagues, but the philosophical argument embedded in every poxmark and tumor. The universe is suffering, life is pain, death is inevitable. The plague god acknowledged these truths and offered not escape but acceptance, a way to stop fighting against entropy and instead become part of its eternal dance. It was monstrously seductive. No, I said, and the word felt like lifting a mountain. No. Humanity's struggle, our refusal to accept the universe's cruelty, our insistence on fighting even when defeat is certain. That's what makes us human. You offer peace through surrender. The Emperor offers purpose through resistance. I choose resistance. Vastian's smile faded, and for the first time I saw something in his transformed features that might have been regret. Then you choose to continue suffering. Grandfather is patient. He will wait. Entropy is patient. Decay is patient. And when your Imperium finally crumbles, and it will crumble, Captain, you can feel it in every failing system and corrupted institution. When your false god's throne finally fails, and humanity stands naked before the universe's truth, Grandfather will still be there, still offering his gifts, still waiting with infinite patience to welcome you home. We fought our way out of that bunker cathedral. Not against Vastian. He simply let us leave, his expression sorrowful as a disappointed parent, watching wayward children storm away from necessary truths. No, we fought against the garden itself, which had apparently decided we'd been given sufficient opportunity to understand, and now needed to be incorporated into its design whether we consented or not. Vines erupted from walls that had been solid ferrocrete moments before. Plants with teeth, actual gnashing teeth where petals should have been, lunged at us with predatory intent. The floor itself became treacherous, transforming into a sludgy biomass that grabbed at our boots with sucking tendrils. We carved through it all with chainsword and flamer, bolt shell and blessed blade, leaving a trail of burning vegetation and cauterized corruption in our wake. Brother Sergeant Kalen fell to a flower that exploded like a frag grenade, showering him with spore-laden pollen that ate through his armor's left pauldron as if the ceramite were mere parchment. I watched the corruption spread across his shoulder guard, saw living rust, if rust could be alive, consume the chapter heraldry with disturbing speed. Kalen tore the entire pauldron assembly free and crushed it underfoot, his enhanced physiology fighting off the infection that had reached his skin. Boils rose on his shoulder, burst, wept, and then, thanks to his Astartes biology, scabbed over and healed. Barely. If any of that spore matter remains on your armor when we return to the ship, we become vectors for this corruption. Theron warned, his force staff incinerating anything that came within 3 meters of our formation. We may have to undergo full decontamination, possibly more extreme measures. He meant exterminatus, orbital cleansing of our own vessel if the infection spread. I nodded understanding, knowing every brother in my command would accept that fate without hesitation if it prevented this plague from spreading beyond Tallarn. That's what it meant to be Adeptus Astartes, the certainty that your life mattered less than the mission, that personal survival was always secondary to humanity's protection. We burst from the underground cathedral back into the courtyard garden, and I immediately knew something had changed. The sky, which had been a sickly green when we'd landed, had darkened to something closer to necrotic purple. Clouds moved with purposeful direction rather than natural weather patterns, and in their depths I could see shapes, vast, titanic shapes that might have been ships, or might have been living creatures, or might have been something for which human language had no referent. "The warp is bleeding through," Tallarn said, his voice tight with controlled panic. The librarian's psychic hood was fully active now, glowing with barely contained power as he fought to maintain his mental shields against whatever was pressing against reality. "Captain, the boundary between materium and immaterium is degrading. This isn't just a standard chaos incursion. Someone has performed a ritual of catastrophic magnitude. Tallarn is being drawn into the Eye of Terror. How is that possible? The Eye is half a galaxy away. Distance becomes meaningless when the warp is involved. Think of it as..." Theron struggled for words even as he maintained his psychic defenses. "As a garden spreading through a house. It doesn't matter which room the garden started in. Once it gains sufficient mass, it simply is the house. Nurgle is claiming this world not by force but by transformation, by making Tallarn more like his garden than like material reality. And once the transformation is complete, once every atom of this world has been touched by his blessing, it will simply cease to exist in our reality. It will become part of the warp, another domain in Nurgle's garden." The full scale of what was happening hit me like a thunderhammer to the chest. This wasn't a raid or an invasion, this was annexation. The slow, methodical consumption of an entire world, its population, its history, its very matter, transformed into substrate for demonic agriculture. And it was working. I could feel reality becoming less solid around us, could sense the fundamental rules that governed existence growing flexible and uncertain. "All units return to the Thunderhawks immediately," I commanded over the Vox. "We're extracting now. Anyone not aboard in 5 minutes gets left behind." "Sir, we haven't recovered any survivors or gathered intelligence on..." "There are no survivors to recover!" I roared, letting the full weight of my centuries of service carry through the transmission. "This world is lost. We retreat, we report, and we pray the Inquisition acts before this corruption spreads beyond the system. Move." We ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. We ran through that impossible garden, through vegetation that clutched at us with hands and mouths and appendages that defied description, back toward the landing zone where our Thunderhawks waited. Behind us, I could hear Vastian's laughter, not mocking but genuinely warm, as if we were children fleeing from an embarrassing truth rather than warriors retreating from genuine horror. The Thunderhawks were still intact, their machine spirits apparently inviolate enough to resist the garden's spread. My tactical squad piled aboard, and I was the last to embark, my training demanding I ensure every brother made it to safety before securing my own extraction. As the assault ramp began to close, I took one final look at Firebase Secundus. It was beautiful in its own horrifying way. The garden had spread to cover the entire installation, transforming military precision into organic chaos, turning human engineering into a monument to growth and change, and the endless cycle of life feeding on death. And somewhere in that garden, 30,000 souls existed in a state of transformed consciousness, freed from pain through the destruction of everything that made them human. I vomited inside my helmet. My transhuman physiology, designed to process toxins and endure conditions that would kill baseline humans, rebelled against the psychosomatic horror of understanding. Theron steadied me as the Thunderhawk lifted off, its engines screaming defiance at the purple sky. "We need to warn the Imperium," I said when I could speak again, "not just about Tallarn, about what Nurgle truly offers. This isn't just disease and decay, it's a philosophy that answers humanity's suffering with transformation. It's insidious because it's built on truth. Life is suffering, death is inevitable, and he offers to make both meaningless through acceptance. The question, Tallarn said softly, is whether anyone will listen. They didn't listen. Not at first. Not when we delivered our report to Sector Command. Not when we showed them the picked captures and bio-readings our armor had recorded. Not when Tallarn submitted his psychic testimony backed by the authority of the Librarius and sealed with his oath of moment. The Administratum classified Tallarn as a standard world loss event. Category Secundus threat level. Orbital bombardment recommended. Follow-up monitoring suggested. Resources allocated for containment. Standard procedure for a world lost to chaos. Tragic, but not unprecedented. They filed reports, updated stellar cartography to mark Tallarn as lost to warp, and moved on to the countless other crises demanding the Imperium's attention. I submitted 3 more reports, then 5, then 10, each one more desperate, each one trying to convey what we'd witnessed in that garden cathedral, trying to make them understand that this wasn't a typical chaos victory, but something fundamentally more dangerous. The response was always the same. Resources were limited, priorities had been established, the sector had more pressing concerns. Then the neighboring systems began to report outbreaks. It started with agricultural worlds. Crops failed, but not through blight or drought, through transformation. Wheat fields became fields of reaching, grasping hands. Fruit trees bore fruit that screamed when picked. Livestock developed human features, and farmers swore their animals spoke to them in dreams, promising peace through acceptance. The Administratum deployed standard quarantine procedures and watched in horror as those procedures failed. You can't quarantine an idea. You can't blockade a philosophy. The infection spread through trade routes, not through physical contact, but through knowledge. Merchants who'd never been near Tallarn suddenly understood the plague god's truth. They'd been carrying stress from failed shipments, anguish over losses, the accumulated suffering that came from life in a universe where everything was slowly falling apart. Nurgle didn't need to touch them directly. He just needed them to understand that their pain could end if they simply accepted transformation. Within 3 months, 17 systems had reported similar outbreaks. Within 6 months, the entire sector was quarantined. Within a year, 3 Inquisitors had declared separate exterminatus orders on worlds too far gone to save. The Ordo Malleus deployed, and for once even they seemed uncertain about how to proceed. I was summoned to a gathering on Terra itself. The journey from the eastern fringe took 3 months through warp routes that were increasingly unstable, and I spent that time reviewing everything we'd witnessed on Tallarn, preparing to make the case I should have made more forcefully from the beginning. The Imperium needed to understand Nurgle's brutality wasn't in his plagues or his diseases, it was in his mercy. The mercy of ending suffering through surrender, the mercy of transformation over death, the mercy of accepting the universe's cruelty as natural rather than fighting it with futile hope. The gathering was held in a chamber deep within the Imperial Palace, in layers I'd never visited despite my centuries of service. Present were 3 Inquisitor Lords, 2 representatives from the Adeptus Mechanicus, a Lord Commander of the Astra Militarum, and, most terrifying of all, a Tribune of the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's own guardians. The last time the Custodes had involved themselves in policy discussions outside the throne room was during the War of the Beast, millennia past. The Tribune was named Valdor Theonis, and looking at him was like looking at a statue of humanity's perfect potential, given life and wrapped in auramite. He listened to my report without interruption. His expression unreadable behind his sentinel blades reflected light. When I finished, the silence stretched for nearly a minute before he spoke. Your observations align with intelligence we've gathered from other sources. Valdor said, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested his larynx had been engineered beyond even Astartes modification. The entity known as Nurgle has altered its operational doctrine. Previously, the plague god spread corruption through violence, through unleashing diseases that killed populations rapidly, through demonic incursions that destroyed worlds with brute force. This new approach is more sophisticated, more dangerous, because it's more appealing. How do we fight an enemy who wins by making people happy? One of the Inquisitors asked, and I heard genuine confusion in his voice. Our entire strategic doctrine assumes the enemy will use force, will terrorize and subjugate. This is conquest through voluntary transformation. We fight it the same way we fight all chaos corruption, another Inquisitor countered. Through faith, through vigilance, through ensuring the Emperor's light shines brighter than any demonic promise. Does it, though? I asked, and the words were out before I could stop them. Every eye in the chamber turned to me, and I felt the weight of judgment from beings whose authority could end my existence with a word. But I'd seen what I'd seen, and lies served no one. Does the Emperor's light shine bright enough? The truth is that most Imperial citizens live in suffering. They toil in darkness. They die in wars they don't understand. They pray to a God who doesn't answer. When Nurgle comes and says, your suffering can end, you just have to accept transformation, how many will refuse? How many can refuse when refusing means continuing to suffer in service to an Imperium that treats them as expendable resources? The silence that followed was absolute. I'd just committed blasphemy in the heart of the Imperial Palace, questioned the Emperor's providence in front of his guardian. I waited for the order to kneel for execution, preparing myself for the end. Instead, Valdor nodded slowly. The Space Marine speaks uncomfortable truth, the Tribune said. The Imperium is failing, slowly, systemically but inevitably. We know this. The Emperor knows this. He has known it since he was interred upon the Golden Throne 10,000 years ago. Every day, the Astronomicon grows weaker. Every year, more worlds fall into darkness. Every century, the barriers between real and unreal grow thinner. And we ask our citizens to have faith, to believe in victory despite all evidence of decline. Is it any wonder that when a god offers peace through surrender, some choose to take it? So what do we do? The Lord Commander asked. How does the Imperium respond to an enemy that wins through offering mercy? Valdor stood, and even the Inquisitors seemed to shrink in his presence. We do what we have always done. We endure, we fight, we refuse surrender even when surrender seems wise, because the alternative, transformation into something that is no longer human, no longer capable of choice or growth or genuine experience, is worse than any suffering we might endure as ourselves. The plague. God offers peace, but it is the peace of the grave, the peace of cessation. We offer something else, hope. Hope that tomorrow might be better, hope that suffering serves purpose, hope that humanity's struggle means something in a universe that cares nothing for meaning. Hope built on a rotting throne and a dying dream, I said quietly. Yes, Valdor agreed, and I saw something in his eyes. Sorrow, perhaps, or exhaustion, or both. Hope built on insufficient foundations, but hope nonetheless, because without it we have nothing left but the choice between extinction and transformation. And I, for one, refuse both. The gathering dissolved with no clear resolution. Orders were issued, enhanced quarantine protocols, increased inquisitorial oversight, propaganda campaigns emphasizing the Emperor's protection. Standard responses to an unprecedented threat. I returned to my chapter, to my duties, knowing that nothing had fundamentally changed. The Imperium would fight this threat the same way it fought all threats, with force and faith, with weapons and dogma, hoping that would be enough. It wouldn't be enough. I knew that with the certainty that comes from seeing truth, however horrible. 3 years passed, then 5, then 10. The sectors around Tallarn continued to fall. Some fell quickly, overwhelmed by demonic incursions, and transformed into garden worlds within months. Others fell slowly, their populations converting through gradual exposure to the plague god's philosophy, choosing transformation over continued suffering. The Imperium responded with purges and quarantines, with orbital bombardments and virus bombing of worlds deemed too corrupted to save. It made no difference. You can't bomb an idea. You can't quarantine understanding. The knowledge that suffering was optional, that transformation offered peace, spread through Vox networks and data conduits, through merchant chatter and soldier gossip. It spread because it resonated with truth. Because every Imperial citizen who'd lost a loved one to meaningless war, who'd watched their world crumble under incompetent governance, who'd prayed for deliverance that never came, they all understood deep in their hearts that the Imperium's promises were hollow. I continued serving, continued fighting, led my brothers through a dozen campaigns, killed traitors and xenos and demons by the hundreds. But I carried Tallarn with me. The memory of that garden cathedral, of Vastian's sorrowful smile, of 30,000 faces preserved in living wood, whispering that it didn't hurt anymore. The worst part? I couldn't definitively say they were wrong. On my 52nd year after Tallarn, I received orders to return to the system. Not to Tallarn itself. That world was gone, fully translated into the warp, existing now as part of Nurgle's garden in the realm of unreality. But to Tallarn Secundus, the outer system mining colony that had somehow remained uncorrupted despite its proximity to the lost world. The colony had sent a distress call, not the usual call for military aid, but something stranger, a request for theological guidance. Their ecclesiarchy priests had stopped preaching. Not refused, stopped. They stood in their pulpits and said nothing, staring at their congregations with expressions of profound uncertainty. When pressed, they all said the same thing. How do I tell them to have faith when I've lost mine? I brought Theron with me. The librarian had aged in ways that had nothing to do with physiology. His psychic sight had shown him too much, forced him to witness the philosophical corruption spreading through the Imperium like rot through timber. He'd requested reassignment 3 times, been denied 3 times, and now carried out his duties with the mechanical precision of someone who no longer believed in ultimate victory, but refused to surrender anyway. Tallarn Secundus was a mining station built into an asteroid, housing perhaps 50,000 souls who extracted precious ores for the Imperium's endless manufactorum. We'd expected to find subtle corruption, the early stages of transformation. Instead, we found a population in crisis, not of body but of spirit. The chief priest met us at the docking bay. Father Ulrich was an old man by baseline human standards, perhaps 70 standard years, with the weathered features of someone who'd spent decades ministering to miners in conditions that slowly ground away hope. He looked at me with eyes that had seen too much and understood too little. "Captain," he said, dispensing with formal greetings, "I need you to answer a question, and I need you to answer honestly, as one servant of the Emperor to another. Speak. Is faith enough?" Ulrich's voice cracked. Is faith in the Emperor, in the Imperium, in humanity's ultimate triumph? Is that enough to justify telling these people to continue suffering? Because I can't do it anymore. I can't stand in the pulpit and promise them salvation through service when I know that most of them will die in darkness, that their children will inherit only more suffering, that the Imperium is slowly dying and taking us all with it. And then I hear about the alternative, about transformation, about peace through acceptance, and I don't know what to tell them anymore. I had no answer. What could I say? That faith was enough when I'd watched it fail on 1,000 worlds. That the Emperor's light was sufficient when it grew dimmer with each passing year. That humanity's suffering served some greater purpose when I couldn't identify what that purpose might be. Theron spoke instead. "Faith isn't enough," the librarian said, his voice gentle despite the harsh truth. "It never was. Faith is what we have when nothing else remains. The Emperor doesn't ask us to have faith because faith will save us. He asks us to have faith because the alternative is surrender. And surrender, even to peace, even to the end of suffering, means the end of humanity as a species capable of choice. That's what Nurgle offers, not transformation into something better, but transformation into something that no longer needs to choose, that no longer can choose, peace through the death of will." "But is that worse?" Ulrich asked, and the desperation in his voice broke something in my chest. "Is it worse to lose the ability to choose if making choices only brings suffering? If every choice leads to more pain, more loss, more watching people you love die in service to an empire that doesn't care they existed?" "Yes," I said, and meant it. "Yes, it's worse, because without choice, without the capacity to decide and act and shape our own fate, we're not human anymore. We're just processes. Biological mechanisms operating according to programmed responses. Nurgle doesn't free his followers from suffering, he frees them from themselves, from everything that makes existence meaningful. The pain, the loss, the grief, those are the price of being real, of mattering, of having a self that can experience anything at all." Father Ulrich looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then I suppose I'll go back to my pulpit and tell them to have faith, to endure, to keep choosing suffering over surrender." He paused. "But I won't lie to them anymore. I'll tell them the truth, that the Emperor might be failing, that the Imperium might be dying, that their faith might not save them, but that choosing to keep fighting anyway, choosing to remain human despite the cost, is the only act of defiance the universe allows us. That's not orthodox ecclesiarchy doctrine," I warned. "No," Ulrich agreed, "it's not. But it's true. And maybe truth is what we need right now, more than comfortable lies." I've been writing this account for 3 months now, recording it in the quiet moments between campaigns, in the darkness of my quarters aboard the adamantine will, trying to shape half a century of experience into something coherent, something that might help others understand what we face when we face Nurgle. The reports call it the long rot. The slow transformation of the Imperium from within, not through violence but through voluntary surrender, world after world choosing peace over struggle, accepting the plague god's gifts, because the alternative, continued service to a failing empire, has become intolerable. The Ordo Malleus has classified it as a Tertius-level existential threat. The Adeptus Custodes have increased their vigilance. The Inquisition has authorized extreme measures. None of it matters. You can't fight philosophy with force. You can't orbital bombard an idea. And Nurgle's truth, that suffering is universal, that decay is inevitable, that transformation offers peace, resonates too deeply with lived experience to be easily dismissed. I've killed 10,000 enemies in my service to the Emperor, traitors, Xenos, demons, heretics of every stripe. Each one died believing in their cause, whether that cause was chaos worship or alien supremacy or simple human greed. And each death changed nothing. The universe kept turning, the Imperium kept decaying, the Golden Throne kept failing, day by day, year by year, millennium by millennium. Nurgle knows this. His gifts are built on the foundation of that knowledge. He doesn't promise victory, he promises acceptance. He doesn't offer strength, he offers surrender to weakness. He doesn't grant immortality, he removes the fear of mortality by transforming death into another phase of existence. And for millions of Imperial citizens ground down by 10,000 years of crushing oppression disguised as divine mandate, that offer is irresistible. This is Nurgle's brutality, not the diseases or the plagues or the corruption of flesh, but the seduction of despair. The offer of peace to people who have known only war. The promise of meaning to people whose suffering has been rendered meaningless by an uncaring universe and an indifferent Imperium. He shows you the truth, that your pain serves no purpose, that your sacrifice will be forgotten, that your death will change nothing, and then offers to make it all stop. Offers to transform that meaningless suffering into something that at least has the satisfaction of peace. How do you fight that? How do you tell someone who's lost everything that they should keep fighting? How do you justify continued suffering in service to an empire that treats its citizens as expendable resources? How do you maintain hope when all evidence suggests hopelessness is the only rational response? I don't have answers. After 3 centuries of service, after watching the Imperium slowly collapse under the weight of its own decay, after seeing what Nurgle offers and understanding why people take it, I don't have answers. All I have is choice. The choice to keep fighting even when fighting seems futile. The choice to resist even when resistance seems meaningless. The choice to remain human with all the pain and suffering that entails, rather than transform into something that no longer feels pain because it no longer feels anything at all. That's not much. Emperor knows it's not enough, but it's what we have. I returned to Tallarn one final time, 53 years after the first visit. Not to Tallarn itself. That was impossible, as the world existed now only in the warp. But to the edge of the system, to the point where real space ended and the garden began. I came alone, against all protocol, leaving my brothers behind with orders sealed in case I didn't return. I needed to see, needed to understand, needed to know if what Vastian had said in that cathedral was true. That transformation brought joy, that surrender ended suffering, that Nurgle's gifts were genuine rather than demonic manipulation. Because if it was true, if they really did feel no pain, if they really had found peace in surrender, then everything I'd fought for, every sacrifice I demanded from my brothers, every order I'd given that led to death in service to a dying empire had been wrong, had been the perpetuation of suffering for no purpose other than refusing to admit defeat. The system's edge was marked by a transition zone where reality became uncertain. Space itself seemed to pulse with organic rhythms, and my armor's sensors registered impossible readings. Temperatures that shouldn't exist, pressure gradients that violated thermodynamics, energy signatures that matched nothing in Imperial databases. I pushed forward in a single pilot transport, feeling reality become less solid with every kilometer. Then I saw it. The garden. Not Tallarn. Tallarn was gone, transformed into substrate for something larger. But the garden itself, visible through the thinning barrier between materium and immaterium, and it was beautiful. That's the word that keeps coming back, however much I hate it. Beautiful in the way a sunset is beautiful, or a supernova, or any natural process that operates according to laws larger than human comprehension. I saw worlds growing like fruit on cosmic trees, saw populations transformed into living architecture that sprawled across impossible geometries, saw diseases that were artworks, each virus individually crafted, each bacterium designed with purpose and care. Saw decay and rebirth cycling in patterns that would take millennia to complete, each phase perfect in its own way. And I saw the faces, billions of them, trillions. Every human who'd ever surrendered to the plague god, preserved in transformation, their consciousness altered but not destroyed. They smiled. All of them smiled, and I couldn't tell if those smiles were genuine expressions of joy or merely the muscular contractions of faces no longer under conscious control. That's when I understood the true horror of it, the true brutality. It wasn't that Nurgle's gifts were lies. It was that I couldn't know if they were truth. Couldn't determine if the transformed souls in that garden truly felt peace, or if they'd simply been rendered incapable of articulating suffering. Couldn't judge whether surrender led to liberation or merely to the destruction of whatever capacity for judgment existed. The uncertainty was the point. Nurgle's ultimate victory wasn't in transforming humanity. It was in making transformation seem like a reasonable choice. In creating a situation where continued resistance appeared indistinguishable from stupid stubbornness, where faith looked like delusion, where hope seemed like a refusal to accept obvious truth. The Plague God didn't need to defeat the Imperium through force. He just needed to make people question whether the Imperium was worth fighting for, whether they were worth fighting for themselves. I turned my transport around and headed back toward real space, toward the diminishing light of the Astronomicon, toward an Imperium that was objectively failing, but subjectively refused to die. And I made my choice. Not because I was certain it was right. I wasn't. Not because I believed in ultimate victory, I didn't, but because the alternative was surrender, and surrender meant the end of choice itself. That was enough. It had to be enough. When I returned to my chapter, I found orders waiting. Not from Sector Command or Fleet Command, but from Terra itself. From the Adeptus Custodes. Tribune Valdor Theonius requested my presence for immediate consultation regarding the Nurgle incursions. The journey to Terra took 4 months through increasingly unstable warp routes. The Astronomicon flickered now, no longer the steady beacon it had been for 10,000 years. Our navigator reported seeing things in the warp that shouldn't exist. Gardens growing in the Imperium, pockets of ordered decay where chaos should reign absolute. The boundaries were failing everywhere, not just around lost worlds like Tallarn. Reality itself was becoming negotiable. I was brought to the Sanctum Imperialis, deep within the palace, deeper than I'd been before. The corridors here were ancient beyond measure, built during the Unification Wars, before the Great Crusade, before the heresy, before everything that had broken the dream and left only the nightmare. Valdor met me at the final checkpoint, his auramite armor gleaming in the dim light of glow globes that had burned for millennia. "Captain Vendamius," he said, and I heard exhaustion in his voice that hadn't been there a decade earlier. "Thank you for coming. The Emperor wishes to acknowledge your service." I stopped walking. The Emperor? Not directly. He cannot speak, cannot leave the throne. But he sees. He knows. And he has made his will known to those of us who stand closest to his light. Valdor continued walking, and I followed, my transhuman heart beating faster than it had in combat. "You've witnessed something that most Imperial citizens never understand. That our enemy offers genuine gifts. That chaos isn't only horror and torment, but also seduction and peace. And you've made your choice to resist anyway, without certainty of victory, without promise of reward. The Emperor recognizes this, values it." We reached a chamber I couldn't describe properly even now. It existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its walls covered in equations and formulae that hurt to look at directly. At the center was a throne, not the golden throne, but something older, simpler. And sitting in it was a figure wrapped in robes that might have been cloth, or might have been light itself. "The Emperor cannot leave his throne," Valdor said quietly. "But he maintains projections. Fragments of consciousness that can interact with reality in ways his imprisoned body cannot. This is one such fragment. It will speak with his voice, carry his authority. Listen." The figure raised its head, and I saw eyes that held the weight of 10,000 years of suffering. When it spoke, the voice wasn't loud, but it filled the chamber completely, resonated in my bones, vibrated in my enhanced organs. "Castor Vendamius," the Emperor said through his projection. "You have witnessed my enemy's mercy and found it more terrible than their cruelty. You have understood why my citizens choose surrender and chosen resistance anyway. You have lost certainty in my victory, but maintained faith in the fight itself. This is what I ask of humanity. Not blind devotion to my divinity. I was never meant to be worshipped, but conscious choice to resist entropy, even when resistance seems futile. You embody that choice. You are what I made the Adeptus Astartes to be. I couldn't speak, couldn't process what was happening. The Emperor, a fragment, a projection, but still him, was speaking to me directly, acknowledging my doubts and my struggles and my choice to fight anyway. The Imperium is failing, the Emperor continued, stating what everyone knew but none dared say. The throne decays, the Astronomicon dims, the barriers thin. Entropy claims everything eventually, even empires built to last eternally. But entropy's victory is not predetermined. Every soul that chooses to resist, that chooses to remain human rather than transform into something that no longer suffers because it no longer is, delays that victory, proves that consciousness matters. That choice has meaning, that the universe's cruelty does not eliminate the value of refusing to surrender to it. "What do you want from me?" I managed to ask. "Continue witnessing," the Emperor said. "Continue choosing. Continue being human despite the cost. That's all any of us can do. Fight until we cannot fight, resist until we cannot resist, and trust that our resistance matters even if we never see its ultimate fruit." You asked Father Ulrich if faith was enough. It's not, it never was. But faith combined with conscious choice, to act as if faith were justified, that's the only weapon we have against enemies who offer peace through surrender of self. You understand this now? Help others understand it too. The projection faded, or I was dismissed, or I simply couldn't maintain presence in that chamber any longer. Valdor guided me out, his hand gentle on my pauldron. "The Emperor speaks to perhaps one mortal in a century," the Tribune said, as we walked back toward the surface levels. "That he spoke to you means he believes your witness, your understanding of Nurgle's true brutality, is important, crucial even. You've seen what I've seen, that our enemy doesn't win through force but through offering relief from suffering. And you've chosen to keep fighting anyway. Make that choice known, make it visible, because others will face the same choice, and they need to see that resistance is possible even without certainty of victory. I'm writing this final entry aboard the Adamantine Will as we prepare for transit to the Nachmund Gauntlet, where chaos incursions have reached critical levels. My brothers are ready, my weapons are blessed, my faith is compromised, but my resolve is absolute. I've seen Nurgle's garden. I've witnessed the transformation of billions into something that claims to feel no pain. I've stood before a projection of the Emperor and heard him acknowledge that the Imperium is failing. None of it changes what I do next. This is Nurgle's brutality, the truth I've spent 53 years learning. He offers peace to people who deserve it, relief to those who've earned rest, transformation to souls ground down by 10,000 years of meaningless suffering. And his offer is genuine. The garden is real. The peace is authentic. The end of suffering is achievable through surrender of self. And I choose to refuse anyway. Not because I'm certain the Imperium will triumph. Not because I believe the Emperor will rise from his throne and heal the galaxy. Not because I think my individual choices matter in the cosmic scheme of entropy and decay. But because the alternative, becoming something that no longer chooses, no longer struggles, no longer is in any meaningful sense, represents the death of everything that makes existence worth enduring. The universe is cruel, life is suffering, decay is inevitable. Nurgle acknowledges these truths and offers escape through transformation. The Emperor acknowledges these truths and demands we resist anyway, not through blind faith but through conscious choice to act as if meaning exists, even when we cannot prove it does. I've made my choice. I'll keep making it every day until I fall in battle, or the Imperium finally collapses or entropy claims everything. Because that choice, to remain human, to keep struggling, to refuse surrender even when surrender seems wise, is the only act of defiance the universe allows us. It's not much. Emperor knows it's not enough, but it's what we have, and that will have to be sufficient. Captain Castor Vendamius, Brazen Minotaur's 4th Company, in the service of the Emperor, unwavering despite all doubt. Year 53. After Tallarn, the long war continues.